Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to address for the second time the Oklahoma English Only Initiative and its possible bearing on Oklahoma Indian language preservation. It's called State Question 689, and if certified, it'll be on your November ballot. If approved, it will add a new statute to Oklahoma law. Now, this is the second show we've done, so I want to recap a little bit for those who may not have seen the other one. We won't go into all of the history of this kind of measure as we did before, but I'd like to just kind of summarize what the bill is and what its status is right now and bring you up to date so that those of you who are concerned about it will have time to do something about it. We have some deadlines looming here. First of all, as to content. Basically, the measure would make English the official language of Oklahoma and outlaw the spending of any state money to publish or provide services in any language other than English. Exceptions are made for the teaching of foreign languages in the schools. It also allows for, but does not require, any money already committed to publications or services in other languages than English to be rerouted to English as a second language type classes. So that kind of summarizes what the measure is about. Before I give you the recent history, let me just say right up front, I think it's based on several mistaken assumptions that are sort of mistaken from the linguistic point of view and from the human point of view. I'm going to list 5 briefly, which we mentioned in the last show where we discussed this. 1, it seems to be saying that diversity is bad. What makes us all American is the English language. If we all spoke English, we'd all be more alike, which I think is clearly false. Number 2, it seems to say, or be based on an assumption that all languages in the United States can be divided into 2 groups, A, English, and B, foreign languages. These are the only type of languages mentioned in the measure, but of course there are also American Indian languages, American Sign Language used by millions of deaf people around the country, and you could even make an argument that Spanish is excluded here. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it certainly does not mention every language that exists in Oklahoma, and it leaves this gray area where potentially I think some harm could be done and that the state would be prevented from supporting minority languages, and especially, as is relevant to this show, American Indian languages, teaching them in the schools, publishing things in those languages and so forth. Number 3, the assumption seems to be there that the status of English in the United States is somehow threatened. Now, in fact, if you think about it, I think we all know that English is not threatened anywhere in the world. It's the rate it's going, it'll take over the entire world linguistically in just a few more years. English is on the upswing. It certainly is not on the decline, and its status is not threatened in the United States whatsoever. 4th, and this is related to the first point about diversity, it seems to be saying that speakers of a common language share identity and thoughts. That is, if we all spoke the same language, we would be more alike. My first point is sort of we are alike because most of us speak English. If we all speak English, we'll be more alike. This point is that if you share a common language, you share some identity, thoughts, politics, whatever. This sort of vague notion seems to be behind the measure. But I think an easy counterexample would be, say, the American Revolution, where there were extreme disagreements on both sides of the Atlantic among English speakers primarily. 5th point, that seems to be being assumed here is that the best way to make people feel more American, shall we say in quotes, is for the government to somehow suppress their language, even though their language is central to what's most important to them in life, to their culture and their identity. How anyone can believe this is beyond me, but some organizations have referred to situations like the language situation in Quebec, in Canada, as evidence that if you want a common national identity, you'd better have just one language and repress the others. Otherwise, there will be war and conflagrations and arguments and all sorts of nastiness. But I think actually what we learned from the situation of Quebec is that if you suppress a minority's language, they'll get really angry about it and they will not feel that they're part of the national identity whatsoever. And I'd like to also cite the example of Switzerland, where there are 4 national languages. They're all highly respected by the government, and there is not a 4-way civil strife in Switzerland. Everything works very smoothly because everyone's language is respected. I think that's really the lesson behind both Quebec and Switzerland. So that respect is more important than trying to pressure people into using only one language. All right, what is the status of this question now? State Question 689. Around 100,000 signatures were collected in a drive sponsored by an organization called U.S. English which is a national organization founded in 1983 by Senator S.I. Hayakawa of California and a racist ophthalmologist named John Tanton. I think they needed 68,000 or something. They collected about 100,000 signatures. These were submitted to the Secretary of State, and this is the procedure you go through. This entire procedure, by the way, is outlined in the Secretary of State's website. If you're on the web, I'll give you the address at the end, and you can look through this for yourself. So the first step is collecting the signatures. Then these were submitted to the Secretary of State, which offers forwarded them to the Supreme Court for verification of the signature count. The Supreme Court then, and this all happened about a week ago, forwarded the initiative back to the Secretary of State, having verified the signatures, at least sufficiently. And then the Secretary of State's office published the content of the proposed law in the newspaper, and this happened last Sunday, September the 3rd. I think it was in the Daily Oklahoman, if you'd like to look at it there in the legal notices. It may have been in other papers in the state as well. The state laws only require that it be published in one major newspaper. Now, from that date, that is from Sunday, September the 3rd, the public has 10 days, so that period ends on September the 13th, to challenge the initiative. That is, if they feel that there's something illegal about the way the signatures were collected in the petition drive, or something inherently evil in the initiative such that it should not go on the ballot, this is a 10-day period during which the public can challenge the initiative. If there's not a successful challenge, it will be on the November ballot. So that's where we are right now. The signatures have been collected and verified. The measure has been published, and we're in that 10-day waiting period. So what are some of the issues that are of particular relevance to this program? First and foremost, of course, is just the possible threat, I think a rather likely threat, to the status of Indian languages in Oklahoma. For example, by outlawing the expenditure of state funds on any language other than English and foreign languages, it would certainly seem to say that the state can no longer support the teaching of Indian languages in the public schools. Will they come to an end? Another type of thing that might happen, the Oklahoma State Historical Society has a collection of videotapes and audio tapes, some of which include important language specimens. And one of the things they do is to back up these tapes every so often to try to keep the tapes fresh so that they don't disintegrate. They sometimes change to a new format, putting them on, I don't know what they're doing these days, maybe on a digital master or CD or something. Let's say the Historical Society has some old Caddo tapes and they'd like to, they're falling apart and they need to copy them and make a new one. Is that then publishing something in a language other than English? Seems to me it would be. I don't think it would be safe to consider that publishing only means written things, because as we discussed recently on a show about copyright, for instance, was originally relating to publishing the written word. So it was talking about handwritten things or printed things, and later things that were duplicated by more modern printing and Xeroxing processes and however they were published. But it also now covers audio recordings and various kinds of reproductions of artworks and all sorts of things. In other words, any medium that's reproduced and distributed or put out for sale, I think, can be considered to be published in the usual sense of the word. So if the state cannot publish things, presumably they cannot make tape recordings or backup tape recordings in languages other than English. A third possible example, there are a number of state-funded museums in this state, many of which have exhibits that relate to Indian peoples. Sometimes Indian language is mentioned in these. One of the things that some people I know have been interested in doing is getting more Indian language in the explanations, the little placard that you see on the wall next to an exhibit, to have some of those in the Indian language as well as in English. That would give a nice Indian language flavor to things and help people see that there are living languages that relate to these cultures that are being exhibited. Presumably that would be outlawed under this law because it would consist of publishing something in a language other than English at state expense. So that there are those kinds of specific threats that I think are very real, and we shouldn't just assume, they would never enforce it that way. I think it's there in the law and that it's a real danger to Indian language preservation. But in general, too, and this would be my second point of sort of issues with this law, it seems to me it's a threat to diversity in general. And remember, there are other important domestic languages besides English. American Sign Language, for instance, used by lots of deaf people and friends and family of deaf people. Some people are under the impression that American Sign Language is just some other kind of form of English spelled out on the hands. Not true at all. ASL is as different from English as Chinese is from Russian, is from Swahili. It's an entirely different language with its own grammar, vocabulary, and so forth. It's a language that people grow up with as native speakers, native users of the language. It's very important. It has its own culture that goes with it. It's an important part of community identity, et cetera, et cetera. And teaching is done, to some extent, I believe, at state expense in public school kind of settings. And there are lots of other settings, clinics, hospitals, and so forth, where American Sign Language is going to be very important. And you could even argue, as I mentioned briefly before, that Spanish is neither English, obviously, nor a foreign language, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we'd have to do some careful research on this, but I believe Spanish was spoken in what's now Oklahoma some years, many years before English ever was. So surely if English is not to be considered a foreign language, Spanish wouldn't be either. If Spanish is neither English nor foreign, then its teaching in the public schools would be outlawed according to this measure. Now, I really don't think that it would be enforced in that way, but sometimes I think when people try to pass laws, you should read the laws and see what they say and take them at their word, and be on your guard against sort of thinking, oh, well, that's not what they mean. Assume that the law means what it says. And the third point is, and this is sort of an amorphous point, but I think the whole thing is kind of mean-spirited. You know, this country was founded in a spirit of diversity and letting each other do things in their own way, pulling together as a country when it was necessary, having some common spirit and so forth, but each having our own cultures, languages, cuisines, looks, dress, all sorts of things. This kind of diversity historically, since this country was founded, has been one of its strong points, I think. And it seems to me that the sort of unspoken agenda behind this kind of law, and there have been many of them around the country in the last few decades, is to say, yeah, but we're the Anglos and we're the majority and we want you to be more like us, and if you don't like it, you can get out. I think that's kind of, now I'm editorializing a lot there, but I think there's a lot of that kind of emotion behind it for some of the most enthusiastic supporters of this kind of law. And I really don't think that we should play into that kind of mean-spirited point of view at all. Now I read on the other time we did a show on this, I read the entire text of the law as it was faxed to me by the Secretary of State's office. We may do that again tonight, but let me go forward a little bit and do some other things first. If we have time, we'll come back and read the actual law. It's really not, it's only about a page or so. But let's first, as to the status, the present status of the law, let's look at it in another kind of way. And that is to think about, well, who's for this law and who's against it? Now, I haven't taken any surveys. I've been surprised, kind of pleasantly surprised, to see a lot of statements against the law in the press recently. But in fact, there's only one institution I really can identify so far in all the phone calling I've done and what I've been reading that is solidly behind this law, and that is the one that was behind the whole petition process from the start, and that's the organization called U.S. English Incorporated. I'll give you their website address at the end of the program if you'd like to check them out further. It's a national organization that sponsored many laws of this type. So they're for it. Now, who's against it? Presumably the proponents who are listed at the end of the law also are for it, and I'll give you their names at the end, two individuals from Lawton who are both in the state legislature. So those are the pros. Who are the cons? Well, the Intertribal Wordpath Society is against this. Now, we're not a political organization, and we don't go out lobbying for candidates and so forth. But I think this falls under the category of things where the facts just need to be made known. But a big part of our mission is to educate the public about facts about language, and I think some facts about language have been misunderstood in the phrasing of laws like this. And also, since our major purpose is to promote the preservation of Indian languages, I think it's our duty to speak up when a law seems to be outlawing a major segment of that effort, or proposing to outlaw it. So we're against it. The Central Oklahoma Green Party is against it. In fact, I spent some time today calling all of the political parties I could think of that are at all active in Oklahoma. The Green Party was the only one I found that had taken a vote and had a position on it. They're against the initiative. I also called the Democrats and the Republicans. They both told me they had no position on it. The Democrats said they would soon. I don't know what soon means. And then the other two parties I called were the Libertarians and the Reform Party, and those are just unknown because I wasn't able to get through to anybody in either case that could give me a position one way or the other on that. Who else is con? There are some Hispanic organizations in the state that take this rather personally, and I think for rather good reason. They feel that it's a threat to their own language and culture. One such organization that I've had trouble reaching so far, but I know they exist in Oklahoma City. They're called Latino Community Development Agency. There's another organization in Tulsa called COHO, Coalition of Hispanic Organizations. So if you'd like to see what they think about it, you might get in touch with those two. I'll give you numbers at the end. And then some newspapers have been coming out against the measure. The first one I saw was the Duncan Banner, I believe. Saw an editorial of theirs reprinted in our Norman transcript, and the Norman transcript just a couple of days ago had an editorial against the measure as well. And I almost forgot in my list of those against the measure, believe it or not, maybe this won't be a surprise to you, but it was to me, Governor Frank Keating has made statements against the measure in a meeting before the American Indian Chamber of Commerce in Tulsa, I believe, a few weeks back. So this is how some of the political alignments are, and you now know the status of the bill, so what can you do about it? If you're concerned about this and think that it should not pass, or think that it threatens your language program, or even if you don't have a language program and you speak only English yourself, if you feel like it's just not right, there are some things that you can do about it. You can make sure that your own tribe, if you're in a tribe, that the language program in your tribe is aware of the situation and of the deadlines and so forth, that we're in this 10-day period for public challenges to the law. So make sure they know what's going on. If you're not in a tribe, help out a tribe near you. Make sure, inform them if they're not already informed. Make some inquiries and look out for your brothers in the neighborhood, so to speak. You can also, even as an individual or an organization or a tribe or anyone, can write the Supreme Court and the Secretary of State during this 10-day period to challenge the law. And I would suggest that everyone do this. I was just talking to people at the Supreme Court today, and they told me, well, I said, does this have to be in legalese? Does it have to, do we have to consult attorneys to do this? What, are you looking for a particular kind of content? Do you want legal precedents? And she said, just anything. The person I talked to there said, anything is fine. If you want to send any kind of challenge, write a letter, address it to the clerk of the Supreme Court, send a copy to the Secretary of State and to the two proponents of the bill. I'll give you their address at the end. And she said, we'll put it in a file. I wasn't rude enough to ask her, will anyone read that file? Presumably and hopefully someone will. I just honestly can't say what kind of an impact this would have, but I suggest that everyone who cares about this matter sit down, spend an hour, think a little bit carefully about this, and make your feelings very clearly known, and send this off to the Supreme Court and the Secretary of State and the proponents of the bill. You might cite, for example, here are some ideas that I've thought of that I plan to put in my letter, that there's a kind of unequal protection aspect to this. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution requires that everyone have equal protection, and yet this law singles out American Indians in Oklahoma, their languages only, as not being, and actually deaf people, they have to add those in, the deaf people too, as not speaking languages that the state can support, and yet the English speakers can have their language taught, and anyone that wants to learn a foreign language can learn that at state expense in the schools. But who's left out? American Indians and American Sign Language users. So I think that's an unequal protection kind of aspect. You might talk about freedom of speech, the First Amendment to the Constitution. Everyone should be able to speak any way they want, including government workers trying to help their clients. According to this law, if it passes, the state will not be able to transact that kind of business, even social services kind of businesses, in a language other than English. You might also say the law is sort of sloppily worded and vague. It fails to show how it will fill its purpose to so-called, this is a quote from the bill, to encourage the learning of English by foreigners. It seems to me if you pull the rug out from under them when they don't yet speak English, that doesn't count as encouragement. You might go along those lines. Another aspect of sort of vagueness is this definition of the word foreign. They sort of assume we all know what we mean by foreign, but its normal everyday meaning is not domestic, not of this country, from some other country, that sort of thing. So by only allowing the teaching of English and foreign languages, it excludes, as we said before, some important domestic languages. for no good reason that the law even argues for. It also provides for languages when required by school systems under guidelines of the State Department of Education. It doesn't require much in the way of foreign languages. Since House Bill 1017, about a decade ago, it requires that schools teach a foreign language, and the implementation language of that law in the ensuing months said, yes, American Indian languages will be okay to fulfill that requirement if the local school district prefers to teach that sort of language rather than Spanish or French or Japanese. But no school system is required to teach more than two. They're allowed to, but according to this bill, and if we get to the full reading of it, you'll see, it only allows for foreign languages to be taught when required by the school systems. So again, it may decrease the number of Indian languages that are taught in public schools. So the deadline for all this commentary and these challenges is September 13th. This will be Wednesday. This show will be airing on Monday and Wednesday. Those of you who see it on Wednesday, you'll already be too late because this is not a postmark date. This needs to be in the hands of the Secretary of State and the Clerk of the Supreme Court by September 13th. So if you see this show on Monday, you still have time to do something about this. You can also, assuming that this does get on the ballot, there are a few other things you can do in the time between now and the actual election. You can call your schools and the Oklahoma State Department of Education with your concerns. You can register more Indian people to vote and other proponents of Indian languages so that they can vote against the measure. I have heard that there's going to be a demonstration at the state capitol, but I wasn't able to track down the date or time yet, so just be on the alert for that in case it does happen. You can contact organizations that are opposed to it and see if you can help them out in some way. You can write, this is an important one, you write letters to the editors of your local papers and encourage other people to do so. You can also schedule local forums and so forth at the public library or wherever such things are held in your community to discuss this issue with voters and get people to talk pro and con on the issue. There is one such meeting this coming Monday, September the 11th, at Rose State College, sponsored by the Citizens League of Oklahoma, from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Now, I want to give you the numbers, dates, and addresses. We have these on the computer. Let's show these and make sure we get them in. And if there's time, we'll read at least part of the law. First is the Intertribal Wordpath Society. We always have this address at the end of the show, but I'll put it here just to remind you. Now, in that email address, it's to wordpath@aol.com. For some reason, I couldn't get the character at to print out, so I used a %, but that should be at. Next, these are the proponents of State Question 689, Ron Kirby and Carol Martin, both, one is from Lawton and one is from Comanche, a little to the southeast of Lawton, I guess. These are their addresses, and if you submit a challenge, you also need to send a copy to them. Next page will show the addresses of the Secretary of State and the Supreme Court Clerk. Basically, your challenge is going to the Supreme Court Clerk, but you need to send copies to the proponents that were on the last page and to the Secretary of State. This needs to be received by September the 13th. Next is the Latino Community Development Agency, which is the Hispanic organization I mentioned in Oklahoma City, 420 Southwest 10th Street. And their phone number is there, 405-236-0701. I don't have an email address for them. They have a website, but it was down today. So you may be able to find out more if you get on your computer. And finally, the organization U.S. English that's behind so many of these laws of this sort. Now, they have an address in Washington, D.C., and they may have one in Oklahoma. What I was able to get for you today was their website, http://www.us-english.org, and they present some arguments for such measures. They even have a little paragraph in there about American Indian languages wherein they say, well, they're a special case and we think it's fine if American Indians preserve their languages. We don't mean to oppose them in any way, so we think they can speak them at their tribal complexes and in their own tribal schools. Anyone who knows anything about Indian education in Oklahoma knows that that's a pretty limited application here, and that what's needed to preserve these languages is much more than that, and that actually they are in our community. We are one community in this state, or so we're supposed to believe. I don't think I'm going to have time to get through all of this. How many minutes left, Whitney? 1 minute left. Oh my gosh. Well, Let me just read the first paragraph at least. In order to encourage every citizen of this state to become more proficient in the English language, thereby facilitating participation in the economic, political, and cultural activities of this state and of the United States, the English language is hereby declared to be the official language of the state of Oklahoma. B, except as otherwise provided in subsection C of this section, the English language shall be the language of the government. All official documents, transactions, proceedings, meetings, or publications issued which are conducted or regulated by, on behalf of, or representing the state and all of its political subdivisions shall be in the English language. Paragraph C talks about the exceptions of teaching foreign languages in the school. Let me read you the relevant sentence. Any state-supported common school or institution of higher education of this state, subject to rules governing the use of foreign languages in such public education systems adopted by the State Board of Education or the Oklahoma State Board of Regents for Higher Education, pursuant to the provisions of the Administrative Procedures Act to promote the following principles. So that's the reference to foreign languages in state-supported schools. There's a section D about money, a section E about when it takes effect and so forth, and section F says nothing in this will contradict the Constitution of the United States of America. I beg to differ. We're running out of time, so see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.